on acceptance and commitment therapy, and in particular a choice point for the treatment of pediatric OCD. I am going to be sharing the general aspects of what ACT is about and how it can blend together with exposure response prevention with ERP when working with children and with teens. Just to start a little bit, I am a psychologist in private practice in Walnut Creek in California. I have been running an intensive treatment program for children, teens, and adults dealing with OCD and related conditions for the last 5-6 years. In the intensive treatment, my clients come for 15 hours a week, and we are delivering ACT and ERP together to all of them. So what I am presenting today basically covers all the skills and how I'm blending ACT and ERP when working with them. Just to give you a little bit of overview, the research showing how acceptance and commitment therapy is effective for the treatment of OCD continues growing. There are over 15 or 17 studies that have been conducted already across different age populations, children, teens, and adults. The largest study has been conducted by John Abramowitz and Michael Towie when they have over 60 clients, 60 adult clients dealing with OCD, and they ran a randomized clinical trial in which one group of clients receiving acceptance and commitment therapy plus ERP, and the other group of clients received ERP based on the inhibitory learning model. The outcome of this study is that both treatments are equally effective. And as you can see here, there are many more studies that are currently being conducted, again, across different demographic groups. I usually like to start by saying that when we think about acceptance and commitment therapy, it has been already very well established that ACT, it is an exposure treatment, because at the core of acceptance and commitment therapy, it's inviting clients to get in touch with all the uncomfortable private experiences they are having under their skin when they're approaching a situation that they care about or a situation that is really scary. So on that sense, ACT is exposure by nature. You cannot deliver an ACT treatment without inviting a person to get in touch with the yucky stuff that shows up when they're doing something that matters. So also all the ACT processes like diffusion, acceptance, self as a context, values, committed action, and contact with the present moment, they do prepare clients to approach whatever has become an aversive stimuli to them. I think what is different when we think about ACT as an exposure-based treatment is that there is a lot of interventions and exercises to help a person to move from the acceptance phase of the internal experience without trying to fix it, changing or getting rid of, into the change phase, which is the values and committed action. So in that sense, ACT has a lot of interventions targeting in particular how to make this shift from the acceptance to the change phase. But even though ACT is an exposure treatment in general that invites people flexibly relate to their internal experiences, it also does targeted exposures. And what I mean by targeted exposure, I mean that even though, again, the treatment in general offers a frame to create an exposure, it also helps a person to get in contact with a particular stimuli that it's aversive for them or it's affecting their life. And the way you do it, when you are blending ACT and ERP in particular, you're putting together all the ACT processes to help a person to get in touch with that particular experience that they are scared of, or they have been avoiding, or they're using a safety behavior when approaching. So I think I really like to clarify that as a model, ACT is exposure, and yet ACT also that what I call very targeted exposures to all types of particular stimuli. If a person is afraid about taking the elevator, if a person is afraid about having panic attacks, if a person is afraid about a particular traumatic memory, or if a person is afraid about fears of contamination, ACT still will be doing some targeted exposures, not only holding the frame of the ACT processes, but really tapping directly into the repertoire, the behavioral repertoire that has been organized because of this fear. one way to think about exposure in ACT terms is as this organized contact with repertoire that it's narrowing or limiting a person's ability to function in life and to do the stuff that matters with them, right? So on that sense, ACT will show people how to stream their behavioral repertoire to approach what matters to them when it matters to them and decrease all the avoidance behaviors or compulsive behaviors as well. One of the things that I think it's very unique of ACT is that we all struggle with fears, worries, anxieties. And it's not a matter of how old we are or where we live, but every single human being is going to experience fear at any point. And sometimes some of us experience fears a lot, all the times. I may be one of those people. So the idea that we can help a person to be cured from anxiety or to not ever feel anxiety is outdated. The whole thing and ACT as a model embraces this, that it's part of our human experience to experience all types of discomfort, anxiety, worries, fears, and obsessions being one of them. And instead of trying to avoid that or postpone or minimize, our task is to learn to live with it as it comes when it comes. The other, I think, frame here that it's very important to clarify is that ACT is also holding that the challenge, even though it's very uncomfortable, it's not about having anxiety. It's about how we respond to anxiety, that's more struggle and more mystery into our lives. For example, if I'm afraid about taking the elevator, if I am walking to visit my friend and there is an elevator, I may have my heart beating fast a little bit. My mind may come with all types of thoughts like, don't go, it's going to be really bad, you may have a panic attack. That experience, it's already uncomfortable. It's primary pain. But if I don't go into the elevator and I have to walk other 5 minutes around trying to take the stairs, or I really don't manage to visit my friend, that's going to add to more isolation, disconnection. Then I'm going to feel bad about myself. My friend may be upset with me. So by engaging in these narrow repertoire of behaviors because I am afraid, it's adding more suffering and more struggle into my life. And we call that a secondary pain. So within the ACT model, we acknowledge and we emphasize that all of us were going to experience all types of discomfort, but that's not a problem. As annoying as it is and as hard as it is, the challenge is how we respond to it. What do we do when we feel the yucky stuff that shows up, especially when we are getting close to do stuff that matters to us? And I have this really super cool question. Don't we all experience fear, anxiety, worries every day? My answer is yes, we do. Wherever we go, there we're going to be experiencing some sense of discomfort. I want to go over briefly the current research on exposure-based treatments to understand more how ACT is blending with ERP. And as we all know, there has been a transition from the habituation model into the inhibitory learning model. So the habituation model, it was based on reduction of SATs, reduction of anxiety when getting in contact with an aversive stimuli. And we assumed that the treatment was effective when the SATs of a person have decreased. However, current research, in particular initiated by Michelle Krask and her group, they have come up with this model that is called the inhibitory learning model, which in a nutshell basically says that there are many variables for exposure treatment to be effective. What I am going to go over just briefly this model so you can understand how ACT is capitalizing current research on exposure to be applied into the therapy room with clients. According to the inhibitory learning model, we have to pay attention to what is the expectation or the belief a person has when approaching, when doing an exposure exercise of a particular situation. And then for the treatment to be effective, we want to have variability. We want to mix it up, the different ways in which a person is approaching that particular situation. Like you can blend interoceptive exposure, with imaginal exposure, or in vivo exposure. You have to help a person to pay attention to the experience, that's attentional focus, and notice what's showing up for that person in the moment when approaching that particular aversive situation. We have to have that person to remove any other safety behavior they may be doing when practicing the exposure. And we have to help a person to label or notice what's their experience. And that's coming from all the theories of affective science that tap into emotional granularity. So during the exposure practice, we are mixing variability. We're helping a person to pay attention, remove the safety behaviors, label what they are feeling for the exposure to be effective. And at the end of the exposure, you check with the client. Was there anything they learned? What do they learn with that particular exposure exercise? And we call that the expectancy violation. So in a nutshell, what this model is trying to say is that when a person develops a particular struggle with an aversive stimuli, whether that's social anxiety or panic attack, there is an association that gets established. And that association doesn't go away. It actually gets active all the time. However, with exposure-based treatments, we are helping the client to develop a new association called a safe-based association, that when you have a lot of experiences of this new association, the new association is going to block the activation of the old association. So basically, when the inhibitory learning model, again, is going to inhibit the activation of the old association. In a nutshell, that's inhibitory learning model. Because of this model, these days, we don't think too much about going in order in exposure hierarchies. The focus is not too much on anxiety reduction. It's more on variability of experiences, variability of learning experiences a person is having. Whether the anxiety goes up and down, that's something we observe and we watch, but we don't try to reduce it or change it. And as you can see, there is this also element about asking a person, what's their cognition, what's their belief when they're approaching something, and what happens afterwards. So this is the current model in exposure-based treatments that we have been applying for the last couple of years to all types of psychological struggles related to anxiety. What ACT is doing is capitalizing all of these elements to show how, when you have variability, when you're mixing the ways of doing exposure, when you're helping a person to notice the yucky stuff that shows up under their skin, and when you're helping a person to remove all the safety behaviors, they can approach with flexibility and with curiosity what they're scared of. So ACT capitalizes all of these when doing exposures and when blending it with ERP in particular. And one of the things that I want to say is that in the old model, in the habituation model, we have been trying to look at the subjective units of distress, the SATs. In this new model, the inhibitory learning model, that is not a variable any longer to consider whether the exposure treatment is effective or not. So that's why they have these rest in peace SATs. Okay. I think one of the things that is important to clarify when you are blending ACT and ERP together is to step back a little bit and think about what you want to accomplish with these exposures as a clinician. I know for me, shifting from being trained on a traditional behavioral model into ACT, it really required that I step back a lot and look, okay, what am I doing? What's a function of my behavior? What I am modeling here? So I think when doing, when putting together ACT and ERP, it's important to look at how do you do exposures, which is not too much in a linear process as any other model will be, because you are modeling flexibility, you're modeling curiosity. So I think it's important to take that in mind. Also, it's not going to be as a problem solving or as something that you have to do right now every time your client is describing a panic attack or having anxiety, right? So the how we do exposure and what we model is key within the ACT model. I think it's also helpful to think about the type of learning you're hoping that happens when you are facilitating an exposure-based treatment. For example, in the habituation model, in the old model, the, the ideal outcome will be that there is a reduction on the levels of anxiety, right? In the inhibitory learning model, we're hoping that there is going to be a shift in the client's beliefs, the negative balance in the expectation, right? And we also see that it's going to be more approximation in terms of approaching whatever they are scared of. Within the ACT model, while we are expecting to see more approximation with aversive stimuli, you're also looking for life improvement. You're also considering and hoping changes in a different domains, their relationships, their education, their school performance, you name it, right? So the type of learning you're hoping to see, it's not only about symptom reduction, but it's about life enhancement, which is very unique to ACT. I think the other aspect you may want to see is how the client relate to their internal experiences, right? Which is, I think, particular also of these models, right? Is the client noticing what the mind is coming up with, or what they are feeling with curiosity, or they're, powering through and going with judgment about, I don't want to feel this. So I think how the client is relating to their internal experience, that's also something you're paying attention, and you're hoping to facilitate some learning when doing exposures. The other area that I would like to add is that when putting together ACT and ERP, I find that it's very helpful to notice how the client is relating to their thinking. Are they getting hooked into how all these ruling thoughts about fear and anxiety? Are they getting hooked on these thoughts like, I cannot handle this will be too much? So I think it's important to also pay attention to how they are relating to thinking in general. And then the other question I will invite you to consider is, as a clinician, how do you know that you're helping a client? In other models, I think the metric has been very clear. You want to see stats reduction, or you want to see symptom reduction, right? Within the ACT model, we certainly want to see that. Of course, we want to see a reduction in how much the client is avoiding a particular situation or a particular activity. But again, you also want to see life enhancement, right? You want to see the quality of life improve. Because of that, in treatment, usually what I do, I use two types of measurements. I use the process-based measurements, looking at the acceptance and action questionnaire for a youth and for adult, and also I'm looking at outcome measurements. And you have a bunch of outcome measurements like the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, the Y-Box, the Liebowitz Scale, the Penn-Worry Questionnaire, you name it. John Abramowitz also has developed an acceptance and action questionnaire for OCD that also used in my practice. So that will be a process-based measurement. And usually once a month, my clients and we go over these measurements to take a look how the treatment is going. So I find that that's a very rich conversation to have both measurements together to take a look what's happening in treatment, but also is coming from this conceptualization of how the treatment could help a client, right? Not just symptom reduction, but also life enhancement. Is this person living the life they want to live? And if not, what adjustments we have to make to facilitate that? And again, I just spoke about that. How do you measure how the treatment is going? Is by looking both, right? How the person is living his or her life or their life, and how they're handling all the anxiety struggles they're dealing with. So I think the process of change and the procedure of change that we're going to be facilitating when putting ACT and ERP together are extremely important. One of the things that I found that it's very different is that, at least for me, when I was training that traditional exposure-based treatments or the habituation model, it was very clear. You help a client to approach, you make sure that there is a reduction on the SATs, and when the SATs are significantly lower, or at least half of the initial point, you know the treatment is effective. But it's a very methodic process, and we know it works. Absolutely, we know it works. But also, I think within ACT, we invited like clinicians and we invite ourselves to step back a little bit and to watch the process in which a person is approaching something they are scared of. So I think for me, I am more interested in how a person is relating to anxiety. What are they doing with the heart is beating fast? What are they doing when their body is having this wave of heat? What are they doing when their mind is going on and is telling them to run away? So I'm curious if they are trying to push down the thought, if they're trying to replace the thought with a positive thought, right? I'm looking how they are making room to sit with that, how they can step back a little bit. So I think the process of facilitating an exposure intervention within this model may not be as linear as in other models, and it really invites all clinicians to step back a little bit and watch with curiosity what's happening when this person is approaching this aversive stimuli. I think the other frame that is important for us to hold is what we model matters completely. When we are doing ACT, I think if we are approaching exposure as something that has to be done and let's go to this and let's power through it, that's the message we're sending. But ideally within the ACT model, we really want to help people to respond flexibly and with some sense of curiosity to their internal experience, right? But that only is going to come based on how we are modeling and what we're modeling in that session. Am I jumping into problem solving mode? Am I jumping into pushing the client to do exposure because I know it works? Or I am trying to find a rhythm and a place to move with the client towards the exposure-based treatment. So I think that one of the things that I encounter a lot when I'm supervising students is that they absolutely know how to do exposures. And when we have a client that, let's say, has panic attacks or social anxiety, they are ready to jump in, which is great. The challenge is like sometimes within this model, it's helpful to create a frame of change while we're doing this awful thing about facing our fears, right? If our clients could have done this before in their own, they would have done it, of course, but it's very challenging. So there is a lot of modeling in this sense. I think there is a lot of modeling this notion that we are going to find our own rhythm together. We're going to face this at your pace. Our task is going to get you out of the comfort zone, and I will be just negotiating constantly, but no one is going to press the accelerator here, right? But I think paying attention to what we are modeling. Am I using exposure as a problem-solving response every time my client is getting stuck? That may be one question to check for yourself all the time, right? Were we flexibly responding and normalizing? Yeah, that's what it happens. Sometimes that's what the mind does, right? Without going into quickly problem solving, but approaching with flexibility what we need to be doing in the room with clients. So I think what I have is a couple of mini tips about how you can pay attention to what you are modeling with your clients. And the first one is always, I think, to normalize that we all experience anxiety. My clients in general, they have heard me talking about the first time when I had a panic attack when I was in my home country in Bolivia, and how sometimes I still have this intrusive image about dying in a car accident, or how sometimes I'm afraid of heights, right? So I think makes a huge difference when we can share that experience. Anxiety is part of our human experience, and even for us who we are fully trained, that doesn't mean that we're not human beings. So just something to consider, right? Just normalize, but it's, I think, makes a difference when we can share some of these direct experiences we may have had with fears, with worries, with anxieties. Within the ACT model also, while you do psychoeducation about what maintains OCD episode, like the compulsions and avoidance, you also try to stay out of talking too much about ERP and it's more about doing ERP, right? The emphasis is about let's learn by doing and let's see how it goes versus talking too much about it. Now, I think this is extremely crucial in particular with OCD because many times as we know with obsessions, our clients may have organized a whole belief system, and not to mention all the mental compulsions of figuring out, rationalizing, replaying, that if you start getting too, I think, didactic about many of these processes, right, the clients could easily either backfire or actually get stuck, and then you are maybe co-reassurance your client, right? So I think one of the things is just to notice if the session is getting a little bit too heady, right? So I think it's better to approach this, let's see what happens with learning by doing than by talking about it. Definitely, I think the ACT sessions are experiential by nature. Yes, in this case, we're going to be doing all types of ERP, right? But I think what is different than other models, at least for me, is that the experience is the experiential aspect is definitely in how a person is approaching a particular stimuli, a particular situation, activity, or object, but also how they are noticing the experience, right? Are we helping a client to notice what they are experiencing in the moment as it's happening? So I think there is a lot of stepping back, and let's watch that. What's showing up for you? Can you tell me more about that? Is it moving? Is it static? Does it have any color? Can you notice who is noticing? Questions like that, right? So I think that facilitates the frame of the exposure session. Super important when you're doing ACT because it's a radical behavioral approach that workability trumps accuracy. It's not about whether the client has a correct way of thinking or an incorrect way of thinking, where it's true or wrong, or right or wrong, or accurate or false, but it's about what works. So many times I think, particularly again with OCD or with chronic worry, it's easy to get stuck because we hear types of thinking. It's like, what? How did that happen? And it's easy to maybe have this pull to actually question that. But if there is one thing I will invite you to question is to question how it works. It's always going back to how it works. I think the other aspect why I think this is super important is because it's easy also to get into creating some rules for clients to behave, right? For example, in any relationship, someone may ask, do you love me? But if a client hears that every time they say, do you love me, it's reassurance, and that's wrong and it's bad, they are not discriminating functionally a statement, right? They're actually learning a rule, right? And the challenge, like in life, the brain could latch into all types of things as an obsession and as a compulsion. If we teach clients to look at the workability of their behaviors, we're also teaching discrimination skills that in the long term are going to help them to live more flexible versus living by rules. So I think this idea that workability trumps accuracy is, I think, super important across the treatment from the beginning. Not, I think it's, yes, I think considering principles is important, right? We don't want to reinforce reassurance. If the function of particular behavior is reassurance, yes, we don't want to do that. But I think we have to also help clients to discriminate when maybe the same form of thinking may not be reassurance and may have a different function in their life. You have heard me talking a lot about that. I think curiosity, it's not just a nice word, but the thing is something that we can model in the room in terms of what's showing up when you do X, what's showing up now, right? What happened when you were holding onto that image, right, as a homework, if you had an exposure homework. And the reason why this is important is because ACT is invested in flexibly living. In order to facilitate that, I think questions like how are very helpful in the therapy room. And then once again, what I think is important to capitalize when you're facilitating ACT and ERP sessions is that it's not about how many exposures the client is doing or how the anxiety is going up and down, left or right. It's about the process in which they are approaching that particular situation or activity, right? Are they approaching that because it matters to them? How they are approaching. Powering through responses or just have to go to this are not very helpful, because at some point they make backfire, right? So they don't have to like the exposures, they don't have to love them, but helping the client to do it as a choice, I think that's why it's different. And as you have heard me saying before, staying out of the content, I think it's key. We don't have to be, we don't have to be too rigid also about that, right? Of course, there is very interesting content, right? I think the clients sometimes are sharing stories, are sharing fun stuff, are sharing movies they like to watch, and that's content. But I think I'm speaking when you're facilitating ACT and ERP together, it's natural that the mind is going to backfire all types of things, thought after thought. And it's easy sometimes to actually try to respond to each one of those thoughts, especially because approaching what we're scared of, it's not easy, it's challenging. And getting stuck with that can easily again become like a session of co-reassurance your clients. So just something to pay attention. And one of the things that I talk a lot is about creating the frame for the work that we're going to be doing. And by the work, I mean the process of approaching what we're caring about. I think it's important to not rush and to not push where our clients are. That doesn't mean that we are never going to negotiate with them. I think sometimes I spend sessions negotiating how much we're approaching, for how long we're doing it. But I think creating the frame about why we're doing this work or approaching the things we're scared is super important before doing the exposure. So again, this is a little bit different than any other models, right? In which we know exposure work, but within the ACT model, exposure is the mean towards values-based living. It's not the goal of the outcome you're exclusively focusing on. What I mean by prompting, I mean that in the context of facilitating an exposure session, we're constantly checking what's showing up. Okay, what are you noticing? What is your mind is doing? Okay, where is that in your body? Is it small? Is it big? How intense is it? I sometimes talk about what's the size of that emotion. It's like a small size, medium size, big size, right? So there is a lot of helping clients to label the affect of what they are experiencing. And that's why I think prompting is super important. And also because you can check the subtleties in which the client is engaging with a particular aversive experience they're having, right? When the thought pops up, what do you feel like doing? Okay, what are we doing right now? Can you just let me know what's happening? So I think that is a more, it slows down the process a little bit, because you're prompting and you're checking how the client is responding. Reinforcing watching the mind versus getting hooked on the mind content. I think many times clients may come to our sessions and may say, oh my gosh, when I was holding the knife next to my kid, it was just really, really uncomfortable, really odd. I felt like running. I thought that this is really crazy. And it's easy that we may try to normalize that it's okay to have those thoughts, right? I think while we are appreciating what the client is thinking, it's helpful to not get hooked on them, right? It's, usually I may say things like, yeah, that's what the mind does. What else did your mind tell you? What else did your mind come up with? So in that way, when you are normalizing that the mind may come up with all types of content, you're not getting hooked on the content. You're watching the content as it comes. Avoiding making assumptions or guesses about the function of a behavior. I think that's what is very unique of behavior therapy in general, on the sense that every single behavior is going to have a different function. And I think our clients, sometimes they develop some rules about how to behave and how to do one thing or another thing. But if we can teach them to discriminate how it works in their life, the possibility of them living with flexibility is actually higher. And I think as a clinician, sometimes it's easy to assume that one behavior either is a compulsion or is an avoidance, or that the consequence of an obsession is this, unless we ask them. For example, when clients have fears of contamination, some of them may be afraid about getting contaminated with germs, others may be afraid about getting sick, other people may be afraid about laying down in the bed for an indefinite period of time, right? So I think if we ask what's the consequence of their fears, we're not going to be making assumptions, and our exposures are also going to be more targeted. And the next point is watching what we are reinforcing. When clients are approaching their exposure exercises, it's not, I think, that they come happy and excited because they did it, right? I think it's scary. They get into panic mode sometimes. They want to drop treatment. But I think our task is to watch what we're reinforcing. Are we reinforcing that it's this awful thing they have to do? Where we reinforce that, yeah, that's what happens sometimes, right? I think it feels yucky, right? And not doing what we care about feels yucky at times. So I think watching what we're reinforcing when clients are doing their exposure is key also for our work. And also I have as another tip here to track ACT processes. I am more interested in how a person is responding to their thinking, to what they are feeling and what they are sensing, versus whether it's increasing in intensity or not. So that's a different way of tracking, right? We do certainly do a tracking, and I think some ACT therapists that are still using SATs, and that's their preference, and that's totally fine. For me, my clinical work, I don't use SATs, but the tracking I'm doing is the track of internal processes. Is the client watching the thought, or is the client hooked on the thought? Is the client watching the emotion, or is the client acting on the emotion? Those are the things that I'm tracking constantly when I'm working with them in the exposure sessions. And when working with clients, and I'm going to go more into the specifics on working with teens now, I usually go over the formulation of how OCD gets maintained and reinforced, and the cycle of OCD gets built up, right? So there's a particular obsession that comes with tons of fear, anxiety, discomfort. Clients are basically going to be doing two things. They engage into compulsions, or they engage into avoidance. That works for a short period of time until they get triggered again and again. And I explained that the compulsions and the avoidance work right away, but in the long term, they make everything worse for them, right? Because they stop doing other things they want to be doing in their life. So if we think about, this is an example of a teenager that had aggressive obsessions about harming his kiddie and his parents, and how he started avoiding first holding his kiddie for a couple of times. That worked, and then a couple of months later, he started having aggressive obsessions about harming his parents. As a result, he stopped going to school, stopped hanging out with his friends, stopped playing with his kiddie, and started getting depressed. So I think when going over the ACT formulation for OCD, I am going beyond, I am going in generally beyond just the consequences of compulsions and avoidance maintaining the OCD cycle. I'm also emphasizing the long-term consequences, what happens in their life. And if you want, you can talk about what happens in their life in other life domains, like their relationships, school, spirituality, religion, the relationship with themselves, right? So from the beginning, when I am going over the LCD formulation, I'm also creating the frame that our work is about life enhancement. It's about helping a teen to have the life they want to have. So I start that with them. And usually for maybe 1-2 weeks, we do a mapping of how the obsessions are showing up for them, what the compulsions they are doing. So usually I go over this the first session, just to share with them what maintains OCD. But again, there is a strong emphasis of looking at the consequences in their life. Usually these are the most common questions I get from clients. Do everyone have weird thoughts? what is OCD at the end, why are the obsessions so intense, why do I have to deal with fear, why do I have intuitions, are there different types of OCD? This is a very, I think, common question that I get a lot. Do people only have fears of contamination? Do people only have aggressive obsessions? If I have this type of OCD now, does it mean that I won't ever get the other type of OCD? So I think the biggest thing that I explain to clients is that everyone has these weird, bizarre, and annoying thoughts. And the brain could latch into anything and everything as an obsession and as a compulsion. And it happens that some people have more reactive brains that are prone to catch into obsessions or compulsions. So our task is to help clients to live a life in which they are going to watch what their mind is doing. So again, my frame is that when we're combining ACT and ERP together, exposure is the mean towards life enhancement and to also live with flexibility. Because in 10 years, my clients could be driving on the freeway and they are going to listen NPR news about a new virus and they may think, do I have that? Did I contract that? Did I wash my hands, right? So I think I am more invested in teaching them that our work is to relate to our mind in a way that works for them to have the life they want to have. And that no one is exempt that in 10 years to 5 years, the brain may just go ballistic and try to grab into all types of things. So I think it's helpful to clarify that from the beginning when working with clients. So there is no idea that once they're done with treatment, they won't ever deal with OCD, or to deconstruct these messages about curing OCD, right? We're speaking about reactive brains that they can actually go into reactivity anytime and anywhere. So I think it's helpful to teach clients how to relate to that reactive brain when it goes into these intense moments. After that, we do usually different types of values exercises. I'm not going to go in detail for this presentation because of time limitations. But one of the things I try to do a couple of values-based exercises because I want to unpack clients. When you are working on ACT, there is this process in which we all have been socialized to say the right thing or to say what we're supposed to say without stepping back, right? So when you are, I think, delivering different types of values exercises, you're also reducing the possibility of clients because we're really helping people to get in touch in different ways with what matters to them. A common question I get from clinicians is, how do you know when to move into a new ERP exercise? I'm sorry, let me step back. So when we do values exercises, then we develop the values-based exposure menu. It's not a hierarchy, it's a values-based exposure menu. In my values-based exposure menu, we do have the classic things like what are the core fears, what are the compulsions, what are the avoidance behaviors, what are the triggers, what are the values, and then we talk about the values-based exercises. When doing the values-based exercises, basically, that's going to be my roadmap for every single session. My students usually ask me that question, how do I know when to move, right? I don't make the decision. When my clients come, I usually hand them the values-based exposure menu and they choose where they are going to or which situation or activity they are going to approach. And I keep track of that. And then if I see that we have an approach, let's say holding a knife or watching commercials about a person with cancer, for example, for like 5 weeks, then I will talk about that, right? So, but basically every single session, my clients are choosing what they are going to be approached, for how long they are going to do it, when they are going to do it. They also know that my job is to help them to get out of their comfort zone or the safety-based zone towards a values-based life, and I will be negotiating. So handing them the values-based exposure menu, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be tracking if there are any other types of avoidance that is kicking in, that they're not doing a particular exposure practice. It only means that you're creating this frame in which they are choosing the rhythm at which they are facing what they are scared of. And I will be negotiating as necessary. We will be doing things like I think we will be doing things like sometimes writing awful things happening to people in a flashcard, or maybe unwrapping candy and eating them from the floor if necessary, right? So I think you will still augment the exposures or the intensity of the exposures, but it's always, I think, looking if that's going to help the client to live towards a values-based living. This is one of the tracking forms that we use in my practice. As you can see, it's from 2019, last year. But what we have here, this is the way that this is for the clinician, basically, right? When we are delivering these exposures, what we're looking at, right? So these are our prompts for us. What's the core obsession we're going to be focus on? What's the compulsion they usually do? What's the avoidant behavior that usually comes along with that obsession? What happens in your life when you do that that compulsion, or you avoid that particular situation, and what makes it worth it for you to approach this? In which way your life will be different if we face this yucky stuff that comes your way, and how we're going to face it, right? We may start with let's hold this knife for maybe 5 minutes to start, and then for how long we're doing, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 minutes. So I think this is also a good frame for clinicians for us to revisit, like every single session. This is the conversation that we have with clients while we are doing this yucky thing of facing our fears. And if we do it, in which way that's going to help me to have the life I want to have, or in which way it's going to help me to be the person I want to be. And then we talk about how we're going to be facing that. So up to this point, I have shared with you some of the general principles to blend ACT and ERP. And now I'm going to jump to talk a little bit about how I blend ACT and ERP for teenagers, using in particular what is called a choice point. One of the things that happens in my work years ago when working with the teens is that it was very clear that, developmentally speaking, teenagers don't like to be told what to do, what to say, or what to think, right? And I had many teams come into my office in which they knew they were dealing with either social anxiety or with panic attacks and OCD, but they were so fed up with this idea about their parents are telling them what to do, or clinicians telling them how to do the exposures. And the outcome was is that they were getting out of treatment as quick as possible. So I think for me, the question was always along the lines of, we know that exposure treatments work. We know that exposure is the frontline treatment for all forms of anxiety. But what can we do to help teenagers to stay a little bit longer on treatment so they can get better? And I tried different versions of how to create different ways to deliver ACT in the room, in the work with them. So I think that Choice Point capitalizes a frame to introduce ACT in a very accessible and jargon-free to the teenagers. If you are familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, you know the Hexaflex, which is pretty standard. The Hexaflex had 6 processes within ACT. I don't go over that with my clients. I usually use with my teenager clients. I usually use the choice point as a way to frame every single exposure session I am going to be doing and the work we're going to be doing. And it's coming again from that place in which we acknowledge that, developmentally speaking, they don't like to be told what to do, right? So I think this idea of choosing what am I going to face, for how long I am going to face it, and how I am going to face it, resonates very well with them for the most part. When introducing the choice point, we do a couple of yoga postures. Sometimes I cannot do them here because the screen is a little bit small. But in general, I use any type of physicalizing exercises to introduce the idea that in order to maintain certain posture, certain balanced posture in your body, you need to find your choice point. You find your balance point in your body. And every time we're facing one of these fearful situations, or one of the worries, or one of the obsessions, our work is going to be about finding that particular choice point to choose how to respond. We have the capacity to choose how to respond to the internal yucky stuff that comes our way. We just forgot, or we don't know how to do it. So I introduce the choice point with a physicalizing activity, but this is the frame to remember or to learn how to choose how to respond to this yucky stuff. And I introduce them to the worksheet I am going to show you in a couple of moments. But I also clarify that the worksheet is only a tool to help us to remember that we can choose over and over. But the ideal, I think, outcome that will be great to see is that when clients leave the office, it's not about how many worksheets they are doing. It's about, can they visualize, can they remember they have the capacity to choose? So that's the idea. The choice point just facilitates a lot the new learning of approaching an adversive situation. This is the choice point, and I'm going to walk through a couple of examples. It's pretty simple, but it also holds all the ACT processes that you are going to be delivering if you use it in your work with teenagers. So basically, at the bottom of the choice point, they are going to be writing a particular exposure activity they are going to be doing, or a triggering situation. And then on top, we're going to write the obsessions that their mind is going to come up with. And then on the left side, we're going to write all types of hooks that keeps them hooked on this obsession. And what's the consequences of getting hooked on that obsession? They get away from the stuff they care about. And on the right side, what are the skills that they can learn to get unhooked from the obsession so they can do more of the stuff that they like to be doing? And what I have here is, if you think about OCD and you think about ACT processes, what we have basically is that there is a triggering situation, that's the activity at the bottom, and then the mind comes with one of these very weird, bizarre, and annoying thoughts, the obsessions. And in the left side, what you have is avoidance, compulsions behaviors, other types of unworkable behaviors, right? Like isolating myself, or maybe drinking or smoking a lot of weed because I'm dealing with OCD, or not dating because no one may like me if they know that I have OCD, right? The unwillingness to approach what matters to me. And then on the right side, what you have is all the ACT processes: diffusion, watching your mind, notice acceptance, right? Contact with the present moment, which is the equivalent of mindfulness, self as a context, noticing who is noticing, values, doing the stuff that matters to me, and committed action. So as you can see, what is important for me to show you on this slide is that I don't talk about the hexaflex, but the choice point as it is capitalizes and shows you how you can think of all these processes in response to unworkable behaviors driven by obsessions. During the exposure sessions with my clients, after I introduce the choice point, we practice one of the choice points, we use it for mapping. But then every single time again they come, I hand them the values-based exposure menu. When we have a variability of different exposure practices we're going to be doing, I show them how to use the choice point multiple times. I think I emphasize a lot the idea of hooks and helpers, right? Ways that we keep ourselves hooked on a particular obsession, and the helpers are the skills that we're going to be learning. Exposure is one of the helpers to get unhooked from the obsession and be able to do the stuff that you care about. And basically every session I am teaching them an unhooking skill. An unhooking skill is going to be a lot of diffusion exercises, and any ACT book that you read is going to have a bunch of these exposure exercises. And then we do basically the values-based exposure activity with clients in session. We throw away the safety crutches. And when doing the exposure practice, I put into action all the principles I showed you before, or I discussed before. I prompt, we pause, I ask questions. Okay, what is your mind doing? How do you want to respond to that? What will make it worth it for you to approach touching the doorknob? okay, how do we want to respond when your mind is telling you, okay, you have to avoid, don't touch it, wash your hands, right? So there is a lot of prompting I'm doing and checking if there is any subtle avoidance that may be happening in the exposure. And always, if I know this any subtle avoidance, or I know this, my clients, for example, if they're dealing with mental compulsions, I invite them to tell me if they are dealing one of the urge to do a mental compulsion, either to replay a scenario or scan their body if they have pedophile OCD. So if they raise their hand or they tell me I'm having an urge, we step back, we pause, and I may ask, okay, how intense is the urge? Okay, why do we do this? How do you want to respond to it? So I think it's the exposures within the ACT model, they look they look like you're prompting a lot, right? But they're always inviting clients to decide how to respond to the yucky stuff. And then again, as you have heard me saying, I use the choice point for every single exposure session I do, from the beginning of treatment to the end of treatment. And clients also have a values-based exposure on the fly worksheet that they are taking every single week. Once a week, sorry, I'm going to drink a little bit of water. Once a week, we complete a values-based exposure on the fly worksheet in which we are planning all the exposures for the week. So in addition to the exposures that we do in session, they also have homework with exposures on the fly that are also coming from the values-based exposure menu. So in that way, the clients are constantly practicing how to choose, how to respond to all this internal experience. And this is a sample of the unhooking log that I go over with clients. As I mentioned, every single exposure session, they are learning one of the unhooking skills. And all what you have here is diffusion broken down into many ways to do it. Physicalizing, visualizing, saying it aloud. And usually I also hand this log to the clients, to the teens, and they choose, whatever unhooking skill they are curious about. And we go over all of them. And as you see here at the bottom, I don't know if you can read this, but as part of the log, I have all the exposure exercises using your body for a values guided, using your body for a values guided exposure, using your imagination, using a situation for values guided exposure. Again, the frame is that exposure is the mean towards values based living. So every session they choose which one of these unhooking skills they are curious about and we're going to be practicing. And then we do that. One of the very popular unhooking skills are things like is scrambling their obsessions, and I'm going to show you that. And after I teach them how to do it, then we go over our choice point, and then we choose what we're going to approach and how we're going to use the unhooking skill. So again, every single session, they are building more diffusion skills and acceptance skills, and they are doing exposures every single session. This is one of the diffusion exercises, singing the obsessions. And this is from a client that had fears of making mistakes and was struggling a lot completing homework. So what we did is she chose one of her favorite songs from Ariana Grande, and then we wrote the lyrics for that song, and that's what you have here. I'm feeling unprepared. I think I need to study more. I don't know the material, and isn't good enough, not good enough. So I think the unhooking skills allow you to be very creative and to be silly with clients. So I think it makes the session a little bit lighter, and you are still doing exposures. Sometimes my clients ask me often, what am I going to do when I'm feeling that obsession so intensely, when I'm having this strong urge to actually run away or to go back home or to ask for reassurance, right? So I talk to clients about the 6-6. And let's see how we do with this because it's a little bit long. So I invite my clients always to check what they are feeling, what they are sensing, right? If I have to summarize, the 6 C's is really about unplugging and unhooking from our mind and grounding ourselves in the moment, bringing ourselves back to the moment. But I also think that it's helpful to teach clients these micro steps to make that happen, because it's not easy, right? Um, yeah, this idea of unplugging ourselves from our mind, it's a little bit foreign sometimes. So I invite clients to describe what they're feeling. I'm noticing I'm having this feeling X. I'm having the thought of, what if I harm my parents? I invite them to check what's happening in their body. I'm noticing my heart is beating fast. I'm noticing my legs are getting shelly. I'm inviting them to check, what do they feel like doing. I feel like getting out of the room. I feel like asking my mom if I did anything weird, um, or if they saw me saying something inappropriate. I invite them to do anything with their body that will help them to ground themselves back in the moment. That can be pressing your feet, that can be wiggling your toes, rolling your shoulders back, rotating your head a little bit. I think it's helpful for clients to know that wherever they are, no matter how intense the emotion or the urge to avoid or to do a compulsion is, they can always find, they can always ground themselves, and using their body is one way to do it. Maybe the easiest way to do it, or the most accessible ways to do it, right? So sometimes we discuss with them other things they can do to ground themselves, like pressing their neck a little bit or rubbing their neck a little bit. But the idea here again is to check what your mind is coming up with and say, my mind is having the thought, I'm having this thought, to check what you're feeling, to check what is your urge, what do you feel like doing, and to actually ground yourselves with your body in the moment to the best you can, to intentionally press your feet, to intentionally slow down your breathing, to intentionally roll your shoulders back or move your back to the front, but do anything with your body that will help you to bring yourself back to the moment, and to check, once you ground yourself, to check what is important to me, how do I want to respond to this particular moment. Now, a clarification here is that once I go over this with my clients, the 6Cs, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be easy peasy and they're going to be using them successfully every single time. It's really not like that. But I think what is very important is to reinforce learning, that the more that we practice to not get hooked in our mind, to unplug from our mind, and the more that we ground ourselves, the better it gets. So more than, yeah, I think the message is always, let's practice. The more that we do it, it does get better, but we have to try harder many times. I will highly recommend you to give it a trial. And again, it's another way in which we are teaching clients how to handle those overwhelming moments when they feel like doing a compulsion or doing an avoidance. And usually what they have been doing is all behaviors, which is do the compulsions and do the avoidance. But when I teach them the 6Cs, it's one way to unplug, ground themselves, and choose how they want to respond. And we're building that capacity all the time. And this is another one that I think I talk a lot about. It's similar to the 6Cs in terms of our task many times is to disconnect from our mind, connect with our body, and check what is outside. So we can just watch to pay attention to, instead of paying attention to what the mind tells us that we should be focusing on, right? It's another variation of how to unplug from the mind and focusing what is in front of you. A classic question I get from my clients is that, but what is in front of me is what? And there's so many things that are in front of us. Life is always happening outside of us. It can be a movie we're watching. It can be a webinar you're participating on. It can be a conversation you're having with a person. So you may want to focus on their accent. You may want to focus on their eyes. You may want to focus on the color of the leaves on the tree, right? But the message here is that there is always life outside of us happening, and we're building the capacity to choose how to respond to it. But that doesn't come natural sometimes, so we have to practice over and over many times. When I'm feeling overwhelmed, I need to find ways to disconnect from my mind, connect with my body, and choose where to pay attention to, versus doing over and over what my mind tells me to do. I think one clarification also is that when I teach these skills, I invite my clients not only to be patient with themselves, but to also um, be forgiving with themselves. Because I think I also know for me, when I'm feeling overwhelmed, it's not that I handle effectively and successfully every moment I feel overwhelmed. Sometimes I mess up and I get very cranky and I get sassy sometimes. So I think I invite clients to notice when that happens, and when the other moment comes, we're going to choose again how to respond to that particular triggering moment. Yeah, I think one of the frames that I use sometimes is it's not about how perfect we do it, it's about the intention that we use when practicing this idea of disconnecting from our mind and grounding with our body. This is one of the, I think, sweetest moment I had with one of my clients years ago. With after discussing about acceptance, my client wrote about this, and it says, acceptance, it's not a process. You can just decide right here, right now, to accept the situation. Don't have to like it, want it, or feel comfortable. I cannot always control the terms of the situations, but I can make the choice to accept them and not let them affect my present choice points. Just something to think about, that when I am going over some of the skills with these clients, I usually say, how will you say it, right? How will you teach me that? How will you describe it? And I'm always, I think, surprised and touched by the things they come up with. So that was from one of my clients, how she's thinking of acceptance. And then this is another unhooking skill that we did with my clients when we were visualizing some of the obsessions, right? My client likes a lot of fantasy stories and princesses. So we come up with this idea of that contamination orbs. It will make me unwell. I will have to wash my hands. I'm going to spread it on everything. It's full of germs. And the scrupulosity orbs. Am I being hurtful? Is this the best way to put it? Am I being truthful? Does this offend God? So again, all of these diffusion skills, the unhooking skills, are really helping a client to watch the mind without getting hooked on it, right? And the kids get a kick from practicing them. And then this is the scrambly obsessions. As you can see on top, you may see that it's the word anxiety that is a scramble. One of my clients' obsessions was, what if I hit pedestrians and don't even know because I'm not careful enough? So after scrambling, it was, if not pedestrians, I don't careful, what if enough, because hit, I am even that. So notice again that you are playing with the content of thoughts and the content of obsessions without getting hooked on them, without responding then they're true or not, false or not, right? So there are sessions when we spend like a bunch of times just scrambling different fears, right? Fears of contamination, fears of mixing bad energies and good energies, you name it. This is another unhooking skill that teens like a lot, that we do some types of art with their obsessions. And of course, they are so much more savvy with technology, and they're using, some of them, they like to use some of these applications on internet to actually enter the obsessions, and they come with these beautiful pieces of art, right? It's just really interesting. But that's another way when we're writing down the obsessions, and you can write down every single obsession, right? So it's another way to actually target the thought action fusion that clients are afraid of hook on many times. We also work around compulsions. I talk about messing up with the compulsions. And what we have is we come up with a plan, right? And I think when we think about mental compulsions or compulsions in general and how to respond to them, either we invite clients to turn them down all the way to zero. If they can, we modify them, right? We readjust the order of them, or we make them difficult, right? That it's not easy for them to engage in that compulsion. So I think usually that's the conversation we have, right? I want to modify this particular compulsion. And if I do that, I will get closer to this particular value in my life. And then they write down how the compulsion looks like and how they want to modify it or make it more difficult for them. Sometimes clients, they want to try to go cold turkey into the compulsion, and that's their choice. We go that. Over times, we try to modify it to start. So I think there are different ways to target this, but it's another unhooking skill within the frame of using the choice point. And then here is one of the choice points that you have as an example of my clients. My client had this fear about cursing obscenities to immigrants, in particular Latin people. And it was funny just to be working with a Latino therapist, right? So the triggering situation for my client was seeing a Latino classmates at the school or going to a Latino restaurant. And the obsession was, what if I curse these bad words about Latinos? And my client used to, if my client was around Latin people, used to make comments like, well, I'm not racist, I'm not one of those white people that don't like immigrants, right? So that was another way in which she was reassuring herself, right? And sometimes asking for reassurance to her friends. So you know that I don't do mean things to immigrants, you know that I don't do mean things or rude things to Latino people, right? So those were the hooks that kept her stuck with this obsession. She was avoiding Latino markets, avoiding gatherings with classmates, pressing her fingers many times, or blinking her eyes twice as a way to neutralize the obsession. So we use the choice point to target that. But that you can see how you can frame every single exposure using it, right? So it allows you to map also the OCD episode and gives you a good sense of what the client is doing. And then you can build that hooking skills. This is another example that you have a client that was taking a PE class on Wednesdays and Fridays and was afraid about getting a neurological disorder. The ways that my client was getting hooked was doing compulsions, like checking bodily sensations, calling doctors, Googling about MS. And the skills to get unhooked were namely the obsessions, Mr. Lost Cause, picturing obsessions as emails with a subject but an open, jumping up and down, wearing a jacket, right? So he can notice all these physical sensations. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. And here's another example that you have of the 15-year-old with fears about making mistakes or having a particular illness. So the message here is that the choice point can allow you to map every single exposure session you have and makes ACT accessible. You don't have to talk about a hexaplex. Of course, you can do it if you want, right? I just find that for the teenagers in general, I rather to have something that is so much more, I think, accessible and less heavy. I don't talk to them about any of the ACT terms of the hexaflex. I will talk about hooks, what keep us hooked, and what are the helpers. How are we going to get unstuck and unhooked from this obsession? And I build all the diffusion logs as you saw, using all the unhooking skills and how I build the acceptance. And we still work on the compulsions and avoidance and exposures. And then here, what you have finally is at the end of every exposure session, what I do is a debriefing of how the exposure session went. And I think the key questions here, and you can have any types of debriefing from it, but what I do is always checking what was the value, why was this exposure important to us, what made it worth it for us to approach the situation, what's the exercise that we did. And that when I ask this question to check your phytonometer, I invite clients to check, right? Were you fighting? Were you pushing word? Were you just trying to get rid with this? Or were you gently having that? Were you just noticing the experience? Just to clarify, this is not about all my clients being the masters of compassion. It's not about that. But it's about noticing that there is a radical difference when you're powering through experience versus when you are facing it with intention and with purpose and as a choice, right? Because you know that in order to be the friend you want to be, you are choosing to sit with the discomfort of going out or holding a knife or all types of things, right? So I think that's what is different. And then I ask clients if the exposure exercise was a move towards their values or away their values, and how they see themselves with that. And then I check with them, did they do any other private or public compulsion? So we're always checking again how they respond to the internal experience during the exposure exercise as well. And this is a sample of the values-based exposure on the go that they do for the week. So we plan basically 7 days of exposures. And we usually do this once a week. And this is one of the homeworks they have when they are planning what exposure exercise they are going to do. And what you have is the question, what do you get enough to do this values-based exposure exercise? So every single exposure is always anchored in the values and what matters to the teams. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email or you can give me a call. I would love to hear from you. And thank you so much to ADAA also for hosting this webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zrita Ona. There'll be a brief moment while we change screen views again.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. I think I got it.
For those of you who purchased continuing education credits for this webinar, you should have received an evaluation link in your registration confirmation email. You must complete the webinar survey and post test questions to receive a CE/CME certificate. Please email us at webinars@adaa.org if you have not received this link. If you are not yet an ADAA member, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer. ADAA members enjoy year-long access to continuing education programs, free access to special interest groups, including online peer consultation groups, promotion of your practice in ADAA's online Find a Therapist directory, significant discounts to ADAA's annual 4-day conference, and much more. Please visit adaa.org to learn more. We would also like to invite you to check out more ADAA on-demand webinars by visiting our website. On behalf of ADAA and our presenter, we thank you for joining us today.